My best friend spent months trying to seduce my husband because he needed to know what's out there. Now, she regrets pissing me. Cassie had been my best friend since we were roommates in nursing school, and she was there for everything important in my life, including being my maid of honor when I married Dan 3 years ago. We did everything together like weekend brunches and wine nights and couple dates when she was dating someone, which wasn't often because she had terrible taste in men. Dan always said he was glad I had such a good friend, and would cook extra food when she came over because he knew she lived on takeout. Everything was perfect until about 6 months ago, when Cassie broke up with her latest disaster boyfriend, who'd been cheating with his ex the whole time. I was there for her like always, bringing ice cream and letting her cry on my couch for weeks. Dan was supportive too, telling her she deserved better and including her in our plans so she wouldn't feel alone. That's when I started noticing things were getting weird. Cassie began texting Dan directly instead of our group chat. Just memes at first, then asking his opinion on guys she matched with on dating apps. Dan showed me everything because he thought it was funny she wanted a male perspective, but I started feeling uncomfortable when the texts came at midnight. Then came the touching. Cassie would squeeze Dan's arm when she laughed at his jokes, rest her hand on his shoulder during conversations, and started hugging him way longer than normal. At game night, she sat next to him instead of me and kept leaning into his space. When I mentioned it later, she said I was being paranoid, and she was just comfortable around him like a brother. Brothers don't usually notice when you wear push-up bras and low-cut tops, though. The clothing thing got ridiculous fast. Cassie started dressing like she was going to a club whenever she came over. Tiny skirts, crop tops, full makeup for Sunday football. She'd bend over right in front of Dan to pick up things she definitely dropped on purpose. She started wearing the same perfume I wore and even bought the same dress I'd worn on my anniversary dinner. Dan noticed and told me privately he was getting creeped out. The breaking point was my birthday dinner. Cassie showed up in a dress so short she couldn't sit without flashing everyone and spent the whole night trying to feed Dan bites of her dessert. She kept telling inside jokes from their texts, and actually sat on his lap during pictures saying it was just for fun. When Dan pushed her off, she played it like he was being uptight. That night, I told her straight up that her behavior toward Dan was inappropriate and needed to stop. She laughed and said I was being insecure, and maybe if I was more fun, Dan wouldn't enjoy talking to her so much. She actually said Dan probably liked having a friend who wasn't so boring and uptight. Then she said married men need female friends to remind them what's out there. I wanted to punch her, but instead I got creative. First, I started including my other friend Rachel in everything. Rachel was single, gorgeous, and actually respectful. Every time Cassie texted about hanging out, I'd invite Rachel too. Cassie hated not being the only single friend around, and Rachel naturally got all the attention Cassie was used to getting. Dan and I would praise Rachel constantly about her job, her apartment, her dating stories, while Cassie sat there steaming. Then I helped Cassie with her dating apps, but with some adjustments. I encouraged her to match with every guy who seemed interested and set up multiple dates every week. I'd help her get ready and hype her up, then text asking for updates every 30 minutes during the dates. When she didn't respond immediately, I'd call the restaurant to check if she was okay. The guys thought she had a stalker friend and usually bailed early. But the masterpiece was introducing Cassie to Dan's coworker, Luke. Luke was attractive, successful, and extremely clingy with women. I told Luke that Cassie loved attention and had mentioned she thought possessive guys were romantic. I told Cassie that Luke was shy and needed someone to really pursue him. Their first date lasted 6 hours because Luke wouldn't let her leave, calling it true connection. Within a week, Luke was texting Cassie hundreds of times a day and showing up at her job with flowers. She tried to complain to me, but I said it was so romantic how obsessed he was, and didn't she want someone who prioritized her? She couldn't break up with him without looking like the bad guy who led him on. While Cassie dealt with Luke, I made sure she knew how great my marriage was. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I started posting about Dan constantly on social media. Every date night got documented with photos of us laughing over dinner. Every inside joke became a public caption. Every sweet thing he did for me got shared where Cassie would definitely see it. I knew she checked my posts because the view counts went up within minutes, but her comments got fewer and fewer until they stopped completely. Dan thought it was weird how much I was suddenly sharing online since I'd never been that type before, but I told him I just wanted to remember the good times. What I really wanted was for Cassie to see exactly what she couldn't have, while Luke sent her his 200th text of the day, asking what she was doing and if she missed him yet. The silence from her end felt better than any response could have. My phone buzzed around 9 on a Wednesday night with Cassie's name flashing on the screen. The text said Luke had shown up at her apartment without warning, carrying bags of groceries and pots and pans because he wanted to cook her a romantic dinner. She wrote that she didn't know how to make him leave without seeming ungrateful since he'd gone to so much trouble, and could I please give her advice on what to say. I smiled at my phone and typed back that it sounded incredibly romantic and devoted. that most women would kill for a guy who prioritized them like that, and she should really appreciate someone who cared enough to surprise her this way. I added that maybe she just wasn't used to real attention after all her bad relationships. She sent back 3 dots like she was typing. Then they disappeared, and I didn't hear from her again that night. Dan walked into the living room and found me refreshing Cassie's Instagram for the 5th time in 10 minutes. He stopped in the doorway and stared at me for a long moment before asking what I was doing. I clicked my phone off fast and said I was just checking in on my friend to make sure she was okay. His expression stayed flat and skeptical in a way that made my stomach twist. He didn't say anything else, just shook his head slightly and went back to the kitchen. But I could feel his disappointment hanging in the air like smoke. I told myself he didn't understand what Cassie had tried to do to us, but the look on his face stayed with me for hours. 2 weeks into the Luke situation, Cassie finally tried to end it. She texted me that morning saying she was going to break up with him at lunch because things were moving too fast and she needed space. I sent back a thumbs up and went about my day at the hospital. Around 2 in the afternoon, my phone blew up with messages from Cassie saying Luke had shown up at her work instead of meeting at the restaurant, and he was crying in the lobby saying she was the only good thing in his life. She said her coworkers were watching the whole thing and she looked like a terrible person. The next text said she'd agreed to give it another chance because he'd made such a scene and she couldn't just dump him in front of everyone. I read the messages twice and felt a warm satisfaction spread through my chest. I planned a game night for that Saturday and invited everyone except Cassie. Rachel came over with her new boyfriend. Dan's coworker brought his wife, and we set up board games and snacks like we used to do. I made sure to take lots of photos of everyone laughing and having fun, posting them throughout the night with captions about how much I loved my amazing friends. Rachel pulled me aside in the kitchen and said it felt mean to leave Cassie out when she was clearly struggling. I told Rachel that Cassie had been too busy with Luke anyway, and besides, she'd made her choices when she decided to disrespect my marriage. Rachel looked uncomfortable but didn't push it further. Cassie texted me on Monday morning saying Luke had started driving her to and from work, so they could spend more time together. She said she couldn't make excuses about being tired or needing to run errands anymore because he was right there waiting in the parking lot every single day. Her message ended with the words that she felt like she couldn't breathe. I waited an hour before responding, then sent back a long text about how relationships require compromise, and maybe she just wasn't used to someone being so attentive after all her flaky exes. I wrote that she should try to appreciate having someone who actually wanted to be around her instead of pushing away a good thing. She left me on read. Dan's best friend Boyd came over on Thursday night for beer and sports. They sat in the living room while I took a shower and I heard their voices through the bathroom door when I turned off the water. Boyd was asking Dan if everything was okay with me because I seemed different lately, more focused on other people's problems than my own life. Dan's voice got quiet and serious as he admitted he was worried about how obsessed I'd become with the whole Cassie situation. He said I wasn't acting like myself, and he didn't know how to bring it up without starting a fight. I stood frozen with my towel wrapped around me, listening to my husband tell his best friend that he was concerned about who I was becoming. Friday afternoon, Cassie called me instead of texting. Her voice was shaky and thick with tears as she told me Luke had gone through her phone last night and gotten upset about her having male coworkers' numbers saved. She said he'd asked why she needed to talk to other men when she had him, and he'd made her explain every single contact in her phone. I could hear the fear under her words, the way she was asking me if this was normal relationship stuff, or if she should be worried. Part of me knew I should tell her to run, but the other part remembered her sitting on Dan's lap at my birthday dinner. I told her Luke was probably just insecure from past relationships, and she should be patient with him while he learned to trust her. She thanked me quietly and hung up. I felt satisfied. My coworker Fairchild caught me in the break room on Monday and mentioned she'd seen me and Dan at that Italian place downtown on Saturday night. She asked if it was weird running into Cassie and Luke there since they'd been sitting just a few tables over. I felt my face get hot as I realized Dan had definitely noticed where we were eating, had probably figured out I'd chosen that specific restaurant because I knew Cassie and Luke would be there. Fairchild kept talking about how cute Dan and I looked together, compared to how tense Cassie's table seemed, and I mumbled something about needing to get back to work. Dan didn't say anything about it that night, but he watched me differently, like he was trying to figure out who I really was. 3 weeks into dating Luke, Cassie texted me a screenshot of a message from him saying he loved her. She wrote that when she didn't say it back right away, he'd gotten really quiet and weird for the past few days. She asked if she was being unreasonable for not feeling the same way yet, if something was wrong with her for not knowing after such a short time. I could have told her that 3 weeks was way too fast and his reaction was manipulative, but instead I typed back that some people just know faster than others, and maybe she should think about why she was so scared of commitment. I added that after all her failed relationships, maybe her instincts about love weren't that reliable anyway. She didn't respond for hours, and when she finally did, it was just a simple okay. That Tuesday night, Dan made spaghetti with his homemade sauce, and we ate at the kitchen table like normal. He asked about my shift at the hospital, and I told him about the patient in room 304 who kept pulling out his IV. We cleared the dishes together, and I was rinsing plates when Dan turned off the water and stood there looking at me. He said we needed to talk about Cassie and what I'd been doing. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my face blank and said I didn't know what he meant. Dan's jaw tightened, and he said he'd been watching me for weeks now, watching me post constantly about us, watching me check my phone every 5 minutes to see if Cassie had responded, watching me plan things specifically to make her feel bad. He said this wasn't like me, and he was uncomfortable with how far I was taking everything. I put down the plate and turned to face him fully, feeling heat rise in my chest. I told him Cassie deserved everything she was getting after what she'd tried to do to our marriage, after she sat on his lap at my birthday dinner and told me married men needed to know what was out there. Dan's face didn't change, and he said that didn't make it okay for me to become someone who deliberately hurt people. He said when he married someone kind and genuine, not someone who manipulated situations to cause pain. The way he looked at me made something cold settle in my gut, because I could see he was seeing a stranger standing in our kitchen. I didn't text Cassie for 2 days after that, and she didn't text me either. On Wednesday, I sent her a funny meme about bad hospital patients, and she left me on read. Thursday morning, I sent her a photo of a dress I was thinking about buying and asked her opinion. Red receipt showed she'd seen it, but no response came through. By Thursday night, I was checking my phone every 10 minutes, scrolling back through our message history to see if I'd missed something. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. She was supposed to be miserable and reaching out to me, not ignoring me completely. Friday afternoon, my phone finally buzzed with her name, and I grabbed it so fast I almost dropped it. Her message said Luke needed a lot of her attention right now, and she'd catch up with me later, maybe next week sometime. I stared at those words, feeling panic instead of victory, because I was losing control of the whole situation. Saturday morning, I drove to Cassie's apartment without calling first. I knocked 3 times before she opened the door, and when she did, I barely recognized her. She'd lost weight and had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. She looked surprised to see me, but stepped back to let me in. Luke was sitting on her couch with his arms stretched across the back cushions like he owned the place. He glanced at me but didn't smile or say hello, just turned his attention back to the TV. Cassie gestured toward the other chair, and I sat down, trying to catch her eye. I asked how she was doing, and she opened her mouth to answer, but Luke cut in saying they were doing great, spending lots of quality time together. Cassie's smile looked forced, and I noticed how she kept her body angled toward Luke like she was monitoring his reactions. I tried asking about her work, and Luke interrupted again to say she'd been so busy lately, that's why she hadn't been responding to people. The way he said people made it clear he meant me specifically. Every time Cassie started to speak, Luke would add something or correct her or finish her sentence. I watched this pattern repeat 4 times in 10 minutes, and realized the monster I'd created was so much worse than I'd intended. Cassie stood up and asked if I wanted some water. I said yes, even though I wasn't thirsty, because I wanted to see if she'd go to the kitchen alone. She did, and Luke immediately got up to follow her. I heard their voices in the other room, and Luke's tone was tight and controlled. He was asking who I was and why I was really there. Cassie's voice sounded nervous as she explained I was her best friend from nursing school. Luke said he thought he was her best friend now. The way he said it made chills run down my spine because there was possession in those words, not affection. Cassie tried to laugh it off, saying people could have multiple friends, but Luke kept pushing, asking why she needed other friends when she had him. I heard her say something about female friendships being different, and Luke went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. They came back into the living room, and Cassie handed me the water with shaking hands. I stayed for 15 more minutes watching Luke touch her arm and her shoulder and her knee, watching her flinch slightly each time but paced on a smile. When I said I needed to go, Luke didn't get up or say goodbye, just kept his eyes on the TV like I'd already stopped existing. I sat in my car in Cassie's parking lot for 20 minutes with my hands gripping the steering wheel. My heart was pounding, and I felt genuinely scared for her safety instead of smugly satisfied about my revenge working. Luke's behavior had crossed from annoying into controlling, and I'd set this whole thing in motion by telling him Cassie liked possessive guys. I'd painted a target on her back and handed him the ammunition, the way he'd followed her into the kitchen, the way he'd monitored every word she said, the way he'd talked about being her best friend like he was replacing everyone else in her life. This wasn't just clingy anymore. This was dangerous. I started my car and drove home with my stomach churning because I'd wanted Cassie to suffer, but not like this. Not with someone who might actually hurt her. Dan was reading in bed when I got home around midnight. I stood in the doorway staring at my phone screen showing Cassie's last message. Dan put down his book and asked what was wrong. The words came out before I could stop them. I told him I'd manipulated Luke into pursuing Cassie by telling him she liked possessive guys. I told him I'd encouraged Cassie to pursue Luke by saying he was shy. I told him I'd set the whole thing up as revenge, and now I was worried Luke might actually be dangerous. Dan's face went through 3 distinct expressions. First shock with his eyes widening, then disappointment with his mouth pulling down at the corners, then anger with his jaw clenching tight. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he got up and walked past me into the hallway. I heard the guest room door close and the lock click into place. Morning light came through the bedroom window, and I hadn't slept at all. I found Dan in the kitchen making coffee, and he didn't look at me when I came in. I poured myself a cup and waited. He finally spoke and said I needed to fix what I'd done before someone got hurt. He said he wasn't sure he could look at me the same way after learning how far I'd taken this revenge. His words cut deeper than anything Cassie had said, because Dan's opinion was the one that actually mattered to me. He said the woman he married wouldn't have deliberately put someone in danger no matter what they'd done. He asked me when I'd become someone who caused harm instead of prevented it. I tried to explain that I just wanted Cassie to feel uncomfortable, to understand what it was like to deal with unwanted attention, but Dan shook his head. He said intentions didn't matter when the result was someone trapped with a controlling person. He left for work without kissing me goodbye. I called Luke's workplace HR department from my cell phone with my number blocked. A woman answered and said her name was Laura Fairchild, and asked how she could help. I described concerning behavior patterns without using Cassie's name. I said an employee had been exhibiting obsessive behavior toward someone they were dating, showing up at their workplace repeatedly, sending hundreds of texts daily, following them into other rooms. Laura asked for the employee's name, and I gave her Luke's full name and department. She said they'd look into it and asked if I wanted to leave my contact information. I said no, and hung up. I knew it wasn't enough to actually separate them since they were dating outside work, and HR couldn't control what happened in their personal lives. My phone buzzed Tuesday afternoon with a photo from Cassie. The image showed a massive flower arrangement on her desk at work, roses and lilies and orchids arranged in an expensive vase. The card was visible in the photo and read, "I can't imagine life without you," in Luke's handwriting. Below the photo, Cassie had typed that she was scared to break up with him now. I stared at those words, feeling the full weight of what I'd done. This wasn't inconvenience anymore. This was actual fear. I'd wanted revenge and gotten it, but the cost was watching my best friend since nursing school become trapped with someone I'd deliberately aimed at her. Thursday morning, I texted Cassie asking to meet for coffee without telling Luke. She agreed, and we met at the place near the hospital where we used to go after our shifts. She looked even more tired than she had on Saturday, and her hands shook slightly when she picked up her cup. I asked her directly how things were going with Luke. She stared into her coffee and admitted she'd been trying to end things for weeks, but he always talked her out of it or made her feel guilty. She said every time she brought up breaking up, he'd cry and say she was the only good thing in his life. She said he'd started talking about moving in together and meeting each other's families, and she didn't know how to make it stop. She looked at me with desperate eyes and asked how she'd gotten here, how she'd ended up trapped with someone after only a few weeks of dating. I wanted to tell her the truth about my role, but the words stuck in my throat because saying them out loud would mean admitting what I'd become. I sat there frozen, unable to form the words that would tell her how I'd destroyed her life on purpose. Dan came home from work that evening and found me still at the kitchen table staring at my phone. He asked what was wrong, and I showed him the text from Cassie about being scared of Luke. His face went hard in a way I'd never seen before, and he sat down across from me. "We needed to fix this right now," he said. "Not tomorrow or next week, but tonight." He pulled out his laptop and started searching for resources about leaving controlling relationships, while I sat there feeling like the worst person alive. We found websites about safety planning and organizations that helped people escape unhealthy situations. Dan made a list of steps Cassie would need to take and asked me to call her right then. I dialed her number with shaking hands and asked if she could come over without telling Luke where she was going. She arrived 20 minutes later, looking over her shoulder as she walked up our driveway. Dan made coffee while I tried to figure out how to start this conversation. Cassie sat on our couch picking at her fingernails and said Luke had been texting her every 5 minutes asking where she was. Dan brought the coffee and sat down in the chair across from us instead of next to me like he usually did. I took a breath and told Cassie I needed to confess something terrible. The words came out in a rush about how I'd set her up with Luke on purpose, how I'd told him she liked possessive guys, how I'd encouraged her to pursue him when he was actually dangerous. Her face went through so many expressions I couldn't track them all. Confusion first, then understanding, then this look of total betrayal that made me want to disappear. She asked why I would do that to her after everything we'd been through together. I admitted I wanted revenge for what she'd done with Dan, for the touching and the texting and the sitting on his lap. She sat back against the couch cushions and laughed this bitter sound that wasn't really a laugh at all. "At least now she knew we were both capable of hurting each other," she said, and there was something almost relieved in her voice, like she'd been waiting for me to prove I was just as bad. Dan cleared his throat and said we could deal with blame later, but right now we needed to get Cassie away from Luke safely. He showed her the resources we'd found and explained that breaking up with someone like Luke required a plan. Cassie looked at the laptop screen and started crying, real tears that made her mascara run down her cheeks. She said she didn't know how to get out because Luke always knew where she was and what she was doing. Dan suggested we contact a therapist who worked with people leaving controlling relationships. He'd found someone named Miriam Holt, who had good reviews and specialized in this exact situation. Cassie agreed to call her the next morning, and Dan offered to go with her to the first appointment if she wanted. I felt like an observer in my own living room watching my husband be the person I should have been. The next day, Cassie met with Miriam and came back to our house afterward to tell us what happened. Miriam had taken her seriously right away and started working on a safety plan. She would see Cassie twice a week and help her prepare for the breakup. The plan included having people present when it happened, blocking all of Luke's contact information immediately after, and documenting everything in case she needed a restraining order. Cassie looked scared, but also determined in a way I hadn't seen since nursing school when we'd studied for our licensing exams together. Over the next 2 weeks, Miriam helped Cassie practice what she would say and prepare for Luke's likely reactions. Dan and I agreed to be at a nearby table during the breakup for safety. Cassie chose a busy restaurant downtown where there would be lots of witnesses. The night came faster than I wanted it to. We got there early and sat at a table where we could see Cassie's booth but weren't obvious. Luke arrived first, and I watched him check his phone repeatedly while he waited. Cassie walked in 10 minutes later, and I could see her hands shaking from across the restaurant. They ordered drinks, and Cassie started talking. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see Luke's face change from confused to upset to angry. His voice got louder, and people at nearby tables started looking over. Cassie stood up to leave, and Luke grabbed her wrist. Dan was out of his seat before I could move. He walked over and told Luke to let go of Cassie's arm. Luke released her, but started crying these loud sobs that made everyone stare. He was saying things about how Cassie was his whole life, and he couldn't live without her. The restaurant manager came over and asked if everything was okay. Cassie said she was leaving, and Luke needed to stay away from her. Luke tried to follow her out, and the manager blocked his path while calling for other staff members. They ended up having to physically escort Luke out through the kitchen entrance while he shouted Cassie's name. We took Cassie back to our house where she sat on the couch shaking and crying. She'd done it, but she looked broken by the experience. The next morning, Luke started texting from different numbers. Cassie blocked each one as they appeared, but they kept coming. He sent emails and tried to contact her through social media, and even created fake accounts to get around her blocks. Miriam told her to save everything and document every attempt at contact. Luke showed up at Cassie's work 3 days later with flowers and a letter. Her boss had to threaten to call the police before he left. Miriam helped Cassie file for a restraining order, and we went with her to the courthouse. The legal process took weeks of paperwork and waiting for court dates. Luke contested the order, and Cassie had to stand in front of a judge and explain why she was afraid of him. She brought all the texts and emails and documented visits. The judge granted the temporary order and set a hearing date for the permanent one. Luke violated the order twice before the hearing, once by showing up at Cassie's apartment building, and once by sending a letter through a friend. Each violation got added to the case file. The day of the final hearing arrived, and Cassie was so nervous she threw up in the courthouse bathroom. Dan and I sat behind her in the courtroom while she testified about Luke's behavior. Luke's lawyer tried to make it sound like she'd led him on and then changed her mind. The judge cut him off and said the evidence was clear. The permanent restraining order was approved. Cassie walked out of the courthouse and started crying again, but this time from relief. 2 months passed before Cassie and I met for coffee at the place near the hospital where we used to go after our shifts. We sat across from each other, and both of us seemed careful with our words. She asked how things were with Dan, and I said we were working on it. I asked how her therapy was going, and she said Miriam was helping her understand why she'd been vulnerable to Luke in the first place. The conversation felt stiff and awkward, like we were strangers trying to be polite. Cassie finally said she didn't know if we could be friends the way we used to be. I agreed and said maybe we could be something different eventually, but we both needed time. She nodded, and we sat in silence for a while. Before she left, she told me she was sorry for what she'd done with Dan, and she understood why I'd been angry. I told her I was sorry for setting her up with Luke, and I'd never forgive myself for putting her in danger. We hugged briefly, and it felt like saying goodbye to someone I used to know. Dan and I started couples therapy the next week. Our therapist asked us both why we were there, and I had to admit what I'd done to Cassie. Dan told the therapist he was struggling with seeing me as both the person he loved and someone who could deliberately cause harm. The therapist helped us talk through what my revenge had revealed about my character. Dan said he'd always thought of me as someone who helped people because I was a nurse, and that's what nurses do. Finding out I could be manipulative and cruel had shaken how he saw me. I tried to explain that I'd felt betrayed and wanted Cassie to hurt the way she'd hurt me. The therapist asked if getting revenge had made me feel better. I admitted it hadn't, and actually I felt worse than before. We went to therapy every week, and slowly Dan started to trust me again, but it wasn't the same easy trust we'd had before. 6 months later, Cassie and I texted occasionally about surface things like work and the weather. We met for coffee every few weeks and talked about safe topics. We were both different people than we'd been a year ago. She was more careful about who she trusted, and I was more aware of what I was capable of doing when I felt threatened. Dan and I were rebuilding our marriage through therapy, but sometimes I caught him looking at me with questions in his eyes that didn't used to be there. He'd ask me things like whether I'd really meant something I said or if I was manipulating him. Each time he asked, it felt like a small cut, because I knew I'd earned his doubt. I'd wanted revenge on Cassie for trying to take what was mine, and I'd gotten it. She'd been trapped with someone dangerous and scared and sorry for what she'd done. But the victory didn't feel like winning. It felt like I'd proven I was exactly the kind of person I'd been angry at her for being. Someone who would hurt their friend to get what they wanted. Someone who valued being right more than being good. I'd protected my marriage but damaged it in the process because Dan now knew what I was capable of when I felt betrayed. Cassie and I would probably never be close friends again, and that was a loss I'd have to carry. I got my revenge and proved she couldn't take my husband, but the cost was becoming someone I didn't recognize when I looked in the mirror.